For Lab 5, you will study the endocrine system. The glands you will need to know are the pineal gland, which releases melatonin. It's located in the epithalamus of the diencephalon. So all this area here is the diencephalon. The pituitary gland, which consists of 2 lobes, and each lobe functions as a separate gland, so the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, the thymus that overlies the heart, the adrenal glands which sit atop the kidneys, and the pancreas. You do not need to know the gonads for this particular lab. We will cover that in the reproductive lab. Let's begin with the pituitary gland. This is the sagittal view of the brain. Here is the cerebral hemisphere. Remember the corpus callosum and the cerebellum. Here is your brainstem. This is part of the epithalamus, that's the pineal gland. And here is the pituitary gland. Recall that the pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus located here by the stalk called the infundibulum. It sits in a depression called the hypophyseal fossa, which is within the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Here in this enlargement, you can see the infundibulum and the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. The pituitary gland is known as the master gland. This is because the hormones it releases control many other glands. The anterior pituitary is known as the adenohypophysis, and it consists of glandular tissue. Recall that glandular tissue is a type of epithelial tissue. As mentioned before, the hypothalamus regulates the activity of the anterior pituitary by releasing tropic hormones. These tropic hormones will either be releasing or inhibiting hormones, and their targets will be the anterior pituitary. What defines a chemical messenger as a hormone is the fact that the hormone travels to its target cell by way of the blood. The blood system used by the hormones released by the hypothalamus is called the hypophyseal portal system. A portal system consists of 2 capillary networks connected by a vein or by veins. Recall that normally veins empty or return the blood back to the heart, but in this case, the vein within the portal system feeds into another capillary network. So the hypophyseal portal system transports the tropic hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is known as the neural hypophysis, and it consists of neural tissue. These hormones are produced by neurons whose cell bodies are located within the hypothalamus. Once the cell bodies synthesize the hormones travel through the axons down to the axon terminals where they are stored. The axons, or fibers, make up a hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. This tract moves through the infundibulum. Therefore, the posterior pituitary hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus but are stored within the posterior pituitary. Action potentials trigger the release of these hormones. Because they are released by neurons, they are called neural hormones. You will need to be able to identify or label these structures on an illustration. It may or may not be the identical illustration that you see here, but if you learn how to label this one, you won't have any problems labeling another illustration. Let's take a look. This is the anterior pituitary. I know it's the anterior pituitary because of the hypophyseal portal system. I can see the blood vessels here. Recall that the hypothalamus will secrete tropic hormones that will regulate the anterior pituitary. Those tropic hormones will either be releasing or inhibiting hormones. They include growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Both of these hormones regulate the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. Thyrotropin releasing hormone that regulates the release of TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone. Corticotropin hormone that regulates the release of ACTH. Gonadotropic releasing hormone regulating the release of FSH and LH. And prolactin inhibiting hormone regulating the release of prolactin. These tropic hormones will move into the primary capillary plexus, through the hypophyseal portal veins, into the secondary capillary plexus. All of these blood vessels make up the hypophyseal portal system. Once in the anterior pituitary, the hormones will leave the secondary capillary plexus and move to their target cells in the anterior pituitary. This is an illustration of the posterior pituitary. I know it is the posterior pituitary because of the presence of the hypophyseal or hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. You have two nuclei within the hypothalamus that are going to secrete the hormones oxytocin and ADH. These two nuclei are the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. Remember that a nucleus is a collection of cell bodies, neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. These nuclei produce or synthesize the hormones from the posterior pituitary. The hormones travel by way of the axons, which make up the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, down to the axon terminals where they are stored. This tract travels through the infundibulum, the stalk. Action potentials are going to trigger the release of the posterior pituitary hormones. Let's review. Be sure that you can tell me the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. For the anterior pituitary gland, it is regulated by tropic hormones from the hypothalamus, and you have the portal system. For the posterior pituitary gland, the hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus, but stored and released by the posterior pituitary. Action potentials trigger the release of these hormones, which are neural hormones. The anterior pituitary consists of glandular tissue, and recall that another name for it is adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary or neural hypophysis consists of neural tissue. Be sure to know the hormones released by the anterior pituitary as well as the posterior pituitary. For the anterior pituitary, the hormones include growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. These four hormones are tropic hormones. TSH goes to the thyroid gland, ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex, FSH and LH go to the gonads. Recall that prolactin goes to the breast and growth hormone goes to many of your body cells. Posterior pituitary hormones include ADH, which goes to your kidneys, and oxytocin, which goes to the smooth muscle in the uterus as well as to your breast. This is a histology slide of the pituitary gland. This is the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and this is the anterior lobe. Notice the difference in the staining. The posterior pituitary is lighter in color than the anterior pituitary. Let's move to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is going to be inferior to the larynx. These two cartilages make up the larynx. This is the thyroid cartilage of the larynx and the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. The thyroid gland is fed by the superior and the inferior thyroid arteries. It consists of two lobes connected by an isthmus. There are two hormones released by the thyroid gland. The follicular cells make up the follicles, the walls of the follicles, which look like balls. And inside the follicles, in the lumen of the follicle, you have a substance called colloid. You will need to know what is found within the colloid. It is the protein thyroglobulin and iodine. The iodine comes from iodide, which is included in your diet, and the follicular cells convert the iodide into iodine. They take the thyroglobulin and the iodine and use that to synthesize the two forms of thyroid hormone, T3 or triiodothyronine, which contains 3 iodines, and T4 or thyroxine, which contains 4 iodines. The parafollicular cells are located between the follicles, and they are going to release the hormone calcitonin. Recall that thyroid hormone is your main metabolic hormone. It regulates your basal metabolic rate. Calcitonin in human beings is not significant, but it will decrease blood calcium levels, so it's involved in regulating blood calcium. This is a histology slide of the thyroid gland. These circular structures are your follicles. The cells that make up the walls of the follicles are your follicular cells, and they are going to synthesize T3 and T4. The substance here inside the lumen of the follicle is the colloid. These here are your parafollicular cells releasing the calcitonin. Let's move on to the parathyroid glands. They will be located on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. So these are the lobes of the thyroid gland. The parathyroid glands usually consist of 4 small clusters of cells, and they release the hormone PTH. Remember, PTH increases blood calcium levels, and this is the main hormone involved in regulating your blood calcium. In this histology slide, you can see this is part of the thyroid gland. You can see the follicles. All of these circular structures are follicles. We've got some parafollicular cells right here. This structure, though, is a parathyroid gland. Let's move on to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands sit atop the kidneys. So here's a kidney with an adrenal gland. Each adrenal gland consists of 2 distinct areas, and they function as separate glands. You have an adrenal cortex, which is this outer area here, so right in here, all the way around. And the adrenal glands look kind of like a pyramid. The adrenal cortex consists of glandular tissue, so this is similar to the anterior pituitary. And then you have in the center the adrenal medulla, which consists of neural tissue, similar to the posterior pituitary. We'll start with the adrenal cortex. As mentioned before, it is glandular tissue, and it will consist of 3 zones. We're going to start with the superficial zone, which is adjacent to the capsule. So here is the capsule right there. Next to the capsule, you have the zona glomerulosa. Do you see how it stains a little bit darker here? It's kind of a darker purple. The zona glomerulosa is going to release a class of hormones called mineralocorticoids, and the reason why they're called that is because they regulate the mineral levels in your plasma, potassium and sodium. The main hormone released from the zona glomerulosa is aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone increases sodium in your plasma and decreases potassium. All of the hormones released by the adrenal cortex are going to be steroids. The next zone, which is actually the largest zone, is going to be the zona fasciculata. The class of hormones released by these cells are your glucocorticoids because they regulate blood glucose levels, and the main hormone is cortisol. These cells are arranged in linear cords. They look like you have coins stacked on top of each other, making columns. The deepest zone is called the zona reticularis. It's located right here. It's adjacent to the medulla. You can see how the medulla is stained a slightly different color. So it's going to be next to the medulla. The cells here are arranged in a net-like fashion, and they release gonatocorticoids. Gonatocorticoids are sex hormones. Androgens are male-like sex hormones. In this illustration, you can actually see the arrangement of the cells in each one of the zones. So here is the capsule. The zona glomerulosa has the cells arranged into clusters. The zona fasciculata consists of cells arranged into linear cords. Cells within the zona reticularis are arranged in a net-like fashion. And then you move into the adrenal medulla. Remember, the adrenal medulla is going to be neural tissue. Let's look at the adrenal medulla, this area right in here. So this is neural tissue, and these are blood vessels. The class of hormones released by the adrenal medulla are the catecholamines. You've heard of these before. Approximately 80% of the hormones released by the medulla are epinephrine. The remaining 20% are norepinephrine. Epinephrine is known as adrenaline. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are identical to the neurotransmitters by the same name that are released by the sympathetic nervous system. What stimulates the release of these catecholamines are sympathetic action potentials. This is an enlargement of the previous histology slide, so you can see the capsule here. You can see this slightly darker purple area. This is going to be the glomerulosa. When I ask you to identify this, I will put the leader line close to the capsule. So you'll be able to see the capsule, and you'll know that the layer or the zone next to the capsule is going to be the zona glomerulosa. Fasciculata is the majority of the cortex. With the reticularis, I will be sure to put the leader line adjacent or close to the medulla, and you can see the difference in the staining here. This is more of a blue, this is more of a purple. The pancreas is a mixed gland, and it's behind the stomach. So you've got the stomach here, this is the esophagus, this is the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. The shape of the pancreas resembles a tadpole. There is a head, a tail, and a body. So let's look at the pancreas. It is a mixed gland. The endocrine portion consists of pancreatic islets. The term islets of Langerhans is an older term, but you can still see that in the literature. It will consist of two types of cells, well actually three, but we're interested in two types of cells. You'll need to know that the beta cells release insulin, and the alpha cells release glucagon. These will be used to regulate your blood glucose levels. The exocrine portion will consist of acinar cells, and the exocrine portion is called the acini. The acini will produce pancreatic juice. This is a histology slide of the pancreas. You can see the lighter staining circular structures, which are the pancreatic islets. And then the darker purple structures around the islets. Here's an islet, so all of this area around the islet would be the acini. Let's look at the thymus. The thymus has two lobes, so it's bilobed. It is located deep to the sternum in the mediastinum and overlays, here's your heart, overlays the heart. It atrophies or decreases in size as you get older, so it's going to be the largest when you are an infant and child. It starts decreasing in size, so you can see this as you get older, and atrophies. This is actually a histology slide in an infant. Each lobe is divided up into lobules. This is one lobule, this is another one, and the lobules are separated by connective tissue septa. So those are these white areas. And these connective tissue septa or walls are actually extensions of the connective tissue capsule that surrounds the thymus. Each lobule consists of two areas, a cortex, which is the darker staining area, and the medulla. Remember, the thymus is a primary lymphoid organ. It releases the hormone thymosin, and that hormone regulates T cell maturation. So this is the site for T cell maturation. One last gland that you need to be sure to look at is the pineal gland located in the diencephalon of the brain. It releases melatonin.